Hi, I'm Mary from Violet Threads, and thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to be sewing up our pepper dress. Now, if you are joining us from our beginner bundle, you've already completed 2 other dresses. This should be your 3rd video. So you've already done our willow skirt pattern, and you've already completed our Luna dress. So this will be pattern number 3 for our beginner bundle. If you're not a beginner and you're just finding this video online, this is also a great pattern to follow along because this dress is something you will use over and over and over again. So if you're a beginner, we're going to be learning how to add a collar with pepper, and we're also going to be inserting sleeves. So you've got a couple of new things we're going to be working on today on this video if you're the beginner, and if not, let's just sew along together.
So first off, we've got our pepper pieces all cut out. You should have 2 skirt panels. Then you should have 2 bodice front panels. One will be your main fabric, the floral for me, and one will be your lining. And then you should have 4 of the bodice back panels cut. 2 of them will be the lining fabric, which for me this is the yellow, and 2 will be the main fabric, which is the floral here. Then we will also have our sleeves, which we should have 2 sleeves cut out. Those are cut on the fold. And then we will also have our pockets if you're creating the pocket option. Now that is optional, but who doesn't love pockets, right? So you'll need 4 of these pocket pieces cut out. And then lastly, we will have our collars. So we should have 4 collar pieces cut. 2 will be main, 2 will be lining. However, I'm using the same yellow for all 4 pieces. So once we have everything cut, then we will begin with our construction of our collar, which we are just going to place one set of the main and the lining collar pieces together with the right sides touching. And then we are going to pin and sew along the outside curved edge and the inside short angled edge, which is at the center. Now that we've sewn around our 2 collar pieces, we're going to go ahead and trim our seam allowance off. Just trim really close to that seam allowance without cutting into the stitch line. And we also want to clip the corners so that we can get a nice crisp cornered edge. So we'll do that for both of our pieces, and then we're going to turn the collar pieces right side out and iron them flat so we have a nice press on them. You can also top stitch them if you prefer. Now we're going to attach our collar onto our main bodice piece. So not the lining piece, but the main fabric. So to do this, we are actually going to have the wrong side of our collar will be touching the right side of our bodice front piece. For me, like I said, my collar is all the same yellow, so it doesn't matter. But if you have a lining for your collar, then that needs to be what's touching the front main of your bodice. And then we're going to go ahead and pin the collars to the bodice front main by matching up the neckline and the straight shoulder edges. I like to try and do this. You want to take time to get it angled just right because you do need to have the collars overlapping just slightly at the center so that once it's sewn, if you measure down, half of an inch from where that's going to be your seam allowance there, then the collars will meet up at that point, but they won't actually be overlapping. So they do overlap at this point, but then once that sewn line is there, you'll see that it's not overlapping what you're actually going to see once it's sewn. So take your time with this, and once you have it aligned properly, then we're going to go ahead and base this collar onto the bodice front main along this pin seam using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once we have our collar basted in place, then we're going to take the bodice back main pieces and we're going to lay them on top of our bodice front main with the right sides touching each other and the raw edges lining up along those shoulder seams. So the collar is now going to be sandwiched in between the front and the back shoulder seams there. So we will pin and sew together along the raw edge of the shoulder, and then we will iron open those seams there. We want to repeat this process with the lining layer as well. So the lining back pieces and the lining front piece, we will sew them at the seams for the shoulders. And then once you've got that done, we're going to actually place the bodice front and back on top of the bodice front and back lining with the right sides touching and the raw edges lining up. Then we will pin together up each side of the back middle and around the neckline. Now we can go ahead and sew along these pinned seams to attach these 2 pieces together. Once we've got that sewn, then we're going to go ahead and trim back our seam allowance by half, which we want to do that along both back sides and then around the neckline. With the neckline, we want to go ahead and clip notches into it, or you can use pinking shears here just to make sure that you can get that neckline to lay nice and flat around that corner, around the curve line. After you've got that seam allowance trimmed back, we are going to understitch the collar area. Now to do that, we are going to open up our lining layer, so pull it away from our main fabric, and we're going to iron the seam allowance towards the lining. Once you've ironed it, you've got your layers still separated, like they're still open here. You're going to go ahead and understitch from one shoulder seam to the opposite shoulder seam. This is going to be a line that you're sewing as close to the stitch line as possible, but still on the lining side. And what this does is this helps keep your collar laying flat without you having to do any top stitching on the top of the main bodice. Next, we will go ahead and turn the bodice right side out, and we will iron that nice and flat so that we can go ahead and continue with top stitching up the back middle and then around the back neckline areas. You can start at the shoulder seams and then sew your way around down to the back, but just make sure that you are not sewing over the top of your collar. We're only doing the back neckline down the back. Once you've got that bodice top stitched, then you can go ahead and set it aside as we are going to begin working on our sleeves. The first thing we'll do with our sleeves is a little bit of prep work. We want to go ahead and prep where we're going to be hemming the bottom of the sleeve eventually. We are not hemming this now. We are just going to be ironing. We're going to turn up the bottom edge of the sleeve by 1/4 inches, then turn it up again another 1/4 inches and iron that each time. Like I said, this is not sewn at this point. It's just prep work so that later on it makes it very easy to go ahead and hem this after we've sewn them. So once you have ironed those, then we're going to go ahead and find the center of the sleeve at the sleeve cap and mark it with a pin or like a fabric marker so you know where that center point is. And then we are going to measure over. It depends on what size you're creating. For me, I had to measure over 2 inches, but the information for that is in the pattern since I'm doing a bigger size. So we'll measure over 2 inches from that center point, that center pin that we already marked, and mark that point on both sides, 2 inches from the middle to the right and 2 inches to the middle to the left. We'll mark that with a pin, and that's going to give us the center area that we are going to sew a gathering stitch between so that we can gather up that once we insert these sleeves into our bodice. So you can sew that gathering stitch in between those 2 pins that we created, but do not gather the sleeve at this time. Now we get to work on attaching our sleeves to the bodice. So this might be something new for you, but you'll see how easy this is. The first thing you'll want to do is lay your bodice flat with your right side of your bodice facing up, looking at you. Then we're going to place our sleeve on top of the bodice with the right sides touching. So the right side of the sleeve should be touching the right side of that bodice that's facing up. And we'll pin the sleeve to the armhole opening, starting along each side and then working your way towards the middle. So once you get into the middle section of your sleeve that we have the pins already on currently, that's where we know that we want to have it pinned up to that point, and then we will gather the sleeve to fit in between those 2 markings that we already had on our sleeve piece. After we've got that pinned up, we will go ahead and sew the sleeve to this armhole along that pin seam, but we want to sew very slowly, just keeping track of exactly where your fabric is. You don't want to accidentally pull some of your bodice fabric into the area where you're sewing your sleeve on. So just keep an eye on that. Keep your fabric pulled nice and taut so that you don't accidentally get extra fabric into the seam that you're sewing right now. After you've sewn it, then we are going to either serge that seam right where we just sewed that seam, or we'll go ahead and trim off half of our seam allowance and finish it with a zigzag stitch. Now, once again, you just want to be careful with this. You can see here how the fabric, when you pull it, it creates a little bit of bunching on the sleeve part, and you don't want to get extra fabric in this area. So whenever you're trimming off your seam allowance, you want to be careful not to trim too much, trim fabric underneath. And also when you're sewing your zigzag stitch or you're serging it, you just want to be careful as you're sewing this so that you don't accidentally add some more fabric in here that you aren't meaning to clip off or you aren't meaning to sew over. Now that we've got both of our sleeves sewn in and zigzag stitched, we are going to go ahead and attach them at the sides, which is going to enclose our bodice. So we will go ahead and pin the bodice front, bodice back, and the sleeves together along the side seam. So we'll have the right sides touching each other for the bodice and the right sides touching each other for the sleeve. And we'll go ahead and pin and sew up this seam here. So it's going to be one continuous line going from the bodice all the way up through the arm. And when you do want to make sure that whenever you're doing this, that the armpit, once you get to this section where the armpit is, you'll lift up your presser foot and you'll turn this fabric so that way you have a nice angle right there. But once you have this edge sewn together, you'll now have created your full sleeve, and your bodice will be connected at the sides. Once we've got these sewn, what we're going to do is go ahead and trim back half of our seam allowance, and we can either finish it with a serger if you have a serger, or you can do a zigzag stitch here. But either way, you want to go ahead and finish off this seam so that it's nice and enclosed. Next up, we're going to go ahead and fold where we had prepped the bottom of our sleeves, where we had ironed them before. We're going to go ahead and fold those up 1/4 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch again, to where those lines that we had already ironed here, it kind of has that memory. And then once it is double folded, we're going to go ahead and sew along that pin seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This will create the hem for both of our sleeves. Now we get to work on our buttonholes. Now the buttonholes are something that you're going to have to figure out with your machine, the exact process. Certain machines have a different buttonhole foot that you'll use, or different settings. But if you are not sure exactly what your machine will require, the best thing is to go ahead and just do a YouTube or Google search with the name of your machine and buttonholes, and then it will give you the process that works best with your machine. Also, the amount of buttons that you use is going to depend highly on the size of the buttons and also what size you're creating, so how big of a bodice you have. So for me, this is what I did. I created 5 buttons, and you'll want to add those buttonholes to the left side of the bodice back, and the actual buttons themselves will be on the right-hand side. Once you've created the buttonholes on your machine, or by hand as well, you can do that option, then you can go ahead and layer your bodice back to where there's 1 inch overlap. So you want to overlap those by 1 inches, the right side and the left side. And then you can mark with a little pin, I have a disappearing ink pen here, through the hole that you created in your buttonhole. Mark that spot so that you know where to sew your button onto on the right hand side. Now that we have our bodice done, we're going to begin working on our skirt and the skirt pockets. If you are not going to create skirt pockets, you can actually skip down to step number 32 in your tutorial. But the first thing you're going to do for both the skirt pockets and for the sides of your skirt is we're going to go ahead and prep them by sewing a zigzag stitch all along the full edges of your pocket, as well as the sides of your front and back skirt pieces. Once you've got those edges all finished off, we are going to go ahead and measure down, if you're creating the dress like I am, 2 inches from the top raw edge, or if you're creating the top version, you're going to measure down 1.5 inches. But that's going to give us the placement for our pockets. So 2 inches down if you're creating the dress, and 1.5 for a top. And then we're going to go ahead and mark that and pin our pockets with the right sides touching and the serged edges lining up. Then we will sew there with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once we've got that sewn, we're going to flip the pockets out so that they are now angled away from the skirt front and the back, and we're going to iron open all those pockets. Then we'll go ahead and place the front and the back skirt pieces together with the right sides touching and all 4 pocket pieces flipped out. Line up all the finished edges of the pockets and the skirt and pin together, starting at the top edge of the skirt and then going around each pocket and then down to the hemline. And then we'll sew along these pinned seams. Then we will hem the bottom edge of our skirt with the same method that we did for our sleeves, which we just turn the fabric up 1/4 of an inch, iron it, and then turn it up another 1/4 of an inch and iron it, and sew along that top fold. Now we're going to go ahead and sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top raw edge of the skirt, and then we're going to gather the skirt up until it is the same width around as our bodice. Your bodice should be buttoned already so that you know the full width around that you're going to be working with. Then we'll go ahead and place our skirt over our bodice with the right sides touching. So the right side of the skirt should be touching the right side of your bodice, and the raw edges of your bodice bottom and your skirt top, they'll be matching up. You'll want to make sure that your gathers are nice and even along this whole process. So I actually like to pin my bodice side seam with the skirt side seam and find the center of my bodice front and the center of my skirt front and match all of those up so that I know how much fabric needs to be gathered in between each of my quarter points. Once you've got it all gathered evenly and pinned, you'll go ahead and sew here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then after that, we'll go ahead and either serge this seam, or we'll go ahead and trim off half of our seam allowance and do a zigzag stitch here so that this is all nice and enclosed. Once you've got that done, then we want to go ahead and iron the seam allowance up towards the bodice, And then when we turn it right side out, we can go ahead and top stitch along that bodice edge so that it's catching the seam allowance under it, and it's going to hold that stitched or the zigzag stitch or the serged seam allowance up against the bodice nice and flat. And voila, you have finished your very own pepper dress. That is absolutely darling. What do you think?